is just cut out like a couple of times.
Yeah. Okay. The recording is now on. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah.
All right,
Recording.
thank you.
It's being recorded. Okay. So, to start, well, first of all, let me ask you what I was just looking at my email before I logged on here. Have you received a message from the provost office indicating that you can change your name at the university? Did you know that? Have you received anything yet? Okay, you will in the next couple of weeks. Apparently now you can change your name at the university. I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. I wonder. It says in the email here that our names are very important to our identities and blah 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 blah. So now, if you wanted to, you could request that your name be changed. Obviously, that's not a legal name change, but they'll change it at the registrar's office and everything. I think that could make a lot of hassle for people down the road. No responses to that. Okay. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Hello.
Hi.
I had a question. Can we have some like printed versions of the like tests for the next time? Because me and some other students we struggle to log in and like half an hour of the test time was already gone. So like is there any other solution for it?
Yeah, I remember there were two of you, right? That had
Yeah,
to.
I was one of them.
Okay, I'll make you a deal. If you write me on the weekend, I'll bring two or three hard copies just in case that happens again. Okay.
Okay.
Uh,
Thank you so much.
but I
So like
want
I should,
everybody. That's okay. I want everybody to try and log in. Okay.
right?
Yeah. I'll just bring a handful. There were just a couple of you last time, but I know that was disruptive and generated a lot of stress. So I will do that. But you have to remind me in advance.
Yeah,
Anastasia.
yeah, for sure.
Okay. Hi, Anastasios.
Right, thank you.
Hey, Professor, how's it going?
It's going.
It's going. I like that. That's good. Um, I was just wondering, do you know when we could expect to get our grades back for the participation?
For the participation. Oh, like the
Yes.
weekly reflections?
Yes.
Well, that won't be until the very end.
Okay.
Actually, they
No.
don't usually give them back. They don't usually post those. But if you want to wait until the end of the course, give them a little bit of time for them to put it on the grade book. You can certainly request that. I know that, speaking of feedback, I know that Hanny has graded her media exercise one papers. I don't know if she's posted them yet. And Nisha is really close, so you can expect to get feedback from that exercise um, in the very near future. And they're popping in to do the tutorial tonight, so you could actually ask them for a specific date. But the participation exercises, that sort of gets tallied up at the very end. If you wanted to, though, Anastasios, I don't think it would be a problem if you wrote your TA and asked, like, what do I have so far? But listen, if you submitted something that's decent and not AI generated, then you should get the point.
Thank you, Professor.
No problem. Okay, so we're just before I get started here tonight, I revealed the information for midterm test two. Again, reminder, it's in person. We're going to the same building as last time. The breakdown is as follows. Okay, I put it on eClass. 20 multiple choice from choice items I generated from the assigned textbook chapters. I generated another 20 from the lectures and supplementary materials and films, like whatever else I gave out. And then I made 10 true false items from the lecture. So once again, a third of the test is going to come from lecture content. And I think I mentioned to you last time that the mean on the lecture items was significantly higher than the mean for the textbook items. All right, and we had a little talk about the possibility. I think what that reflected is that students just aren't spending enough time with the textbook. So everyone has a second chance now to do even better than the first one. We'll open it up right at 7. Did I give you a free navigation last time? I can't remember. Did I let you go back to previous questions on the test? Okay, I don't have my chat open. Guess people.
Yes, Professor.
Yes, I did. Okay, so I'm going to do that again. All right. It violates the best practices guide, but too many people freak out when you set it to sequential. Okay, and I don't really think it had a huge effect. So I'm going to set the navigation parameter to free, and of course, all students who have a letter of accommodation will have their time parameter. If you're writing at alt exams, your time parameters will be set in accordance with your letter of accommodation. So before I go to the PowerPoint for tonight, any questions for about midterm 2? Anybody? Same drill as last time. Okay, let's go to it. I'm going to depart from your textbook tonight. The assigned chapter for tonight. Oh, jeez. Addresses the sort of biological basis of certain personality factors, and it's fine and it's well written. But if you ask people in the field, okay, who are doing research now, like where's the cutting edge stuff, research happening in the field of personality, I dare say that most of them will say that it comes from this field that we're going to talk about tonight, the field of behavior genetics. So there is some discussion of the concepts we're going to talk about tonight, but I'm going to give you a full grown-up lecture on behavior genetics, so that when you interface with this material down the road, and invariably you will, you'll be well prepared. I'll tell you what the field. I'll define the field, and then I'll kind of stretch it out as we go along. Behavior genetics as a discipline estimates the proportion of variability, okay, in any human behavior. We can look at aggression, we can look at neuroticism. When you look at large groups of people, you always see variation. What it allows us to do, this field, is to estimate the proportion of variance or variability in a trait that can be explained by genetic factors. Okay? When this field sort of hit the mark, and it is a very controversial one, okay? Researchers were asking the question, are there any psychological traits, including personality traits, that are influenced by genes? Now, okay, they're asking the question, are there any psychological traits that don't show a genetic influence? I'm not going to talk about this slide because I use it in my evolutionary course. It's a field that arouses strong emotions in people outside the university, but especially in people inside the university. There is now a very large and very consistent body of evidence indicating the influence of genetic factors on a huge range of psychological traits, not just personality traits, but cognitive traits, attitudes, interests, whatever psychologists measure, okay? It seems to be the case that many psychological traits are influenced to some extent by genes. And today I want to look at the methodology, some of the theories, and then some data, okay, personality data from this field. It's been around for a long time. It's certainly been around for around 100 years. I would say modern behavior genetics started in the 60s, and people have strong feelings about it. Okay. Having said that, psychologists in animal psychology, in comparative psychology, they've always been okay with the ideas from behavior genetics. But it became very, very contentious when behavior geneticists started to apply their methods to the study of humans. And it's worthwhile spending a couple minutes here and pausing to think about or reflect on what it is that disturbs us about this field. So you get up in the morning and you open the newspaper and you read that your predisposition to develop coronary heart disease or breast cancer has a genetic basis, that it's influenced by genes. Nowadays, people actually pay money for that. Anybody done this? 23andMe or what's the other one? Ancestry. Okay, for like a couple $100. And they always have specials at Christmas time and Mother's Day, that kind of thing. People pay for this information out of their pocket. We embrace that knowledge. But when you wake up in the morning and you read that your tendency to be shy or your tendency to be a worrier or your IQ, okay, or some cognitive ability is under genetic influence, it makes us nervous. Why is that? I'm putting it out there. I'm waiting for your speculations. Mia says lack of control. Yeah, okay, so we make the assumption, thank you, Mia, that if a trait has a genetic basis, then somehow it renders that trait immutable or unchangeable. Okay. How many people in the class have a sweet tooth, like sweet foods? I'll join you there. Okay. That's under genetic control. That's under genetic control for a very, very good reason, or a number of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that for most human neonates, the first substance that we ingest is breast milk. And breast milk is qualitatively sweet. So it makes all the sense in the world for the human organism to come into the world with a preference for sweet tasting food substances. But when you get to my age, okay, a number of you, and according to predictions, more people in your cohort than ever before will be at risk of developing diabetes. Okay, the predictions for your age group are really awful. So you go for a checkup and your doctor says, your blood sugar levels are too high. And you say, well, okay, before you give me the drug, okay, let me see if I can modify my sugar intake. And you can modify your sugar intake. We do have some control over that to some extent. It doesn't mean that your preference and desire for Black Forest cake or whatever, plug in your favorite dessert here, is going to go away. But you can exert some control over that behavior. I would suggest to you that the best way to see most psychological traits, personality traits in particular, is that they're all modifiable to some extent, but almost never completely. Okay, so we all started the term, I'm going to identify as a procrastinator. There's probably a few procrastinators in the crowd here. We always start the term in the same way, yeah? We make a deal with ourselves. Okay, this term, I'm going to stay on top of everything. Maybe you bought one of those fancy time organizers, or maybe you took one of the many courses that are offered at the university to help procrastinators. You can get better. But here we are, just a little path, a little past the halfway point. Where are you? Probably behind, the way we always are. Okay, so you can modify traits to some extent, but rarely completely. So we don't like this idea that if something, we make the erroneous assumption, I should say, that if something has a genetic basis, that it's completely unchangeable. We get really tense, okay, when we apply behavior genetic analyses to aspects of our lives that are sacred to us, that are so personalized. Our love lives, our romantic lives, our spiritual lives. Okay? So if I asked you in a conversation, why are you with those of you who are in relationships right now? Why are you with the person that you're with? You'd give me an answer, or likely that goes something like, I'm with this person. I chose this person, okay, from the huge sample space of potential mating partners that are available to people your age. You selected so and so for the following reasons, okay? It feels like we make a choice, you know? But when you look at data from evolutionary psychology on sex differences and mating preferences, you see really clearly that when you ask males and females, what traits are important to you in a long-term mating partner, you get different lists. I mean, there is some overlap, but everywhere in the world where males and females, chromosomal males and females, have been asked, what do you want in a long-term mating partner? Females prize different traits than do males. There's a huge genre of research looking at what females choose when they go to sperm banks. Okay, fascinating stuff. And you think about that reality when a female goes to buy sperm, okay, to buy sperm cells, they check off things on a menu. You have to kind of bring to the forefront of consciousness all that stuff that is subconscious for the rest of us. You get a set of traits, okay, that don't look like the traits that show up on lists when you ask males. Okay, so the idea that even something as sacred to us as our mating behavior may be influenced by genetics is a horrible thing to think about. What else bugs us about the idea that certain traits can are under genetic influence? Because that's not the only reason. Okay, nobody? Well, another reason is it absolutely flies in the face of our egalitarian philosophy, our Western egalitarian philosophy. The central notion in psychology, the central notion in the behavioral sciences for a really, really long time was the idea that the environment, that socialization factors shape the individual, that we're all born equal, we're just blobs, you know. And then when we look at groups of individuals down the developmental timeline, we see differences. All of those differences can be understood in terms of differential experience. That philosophy is deeply ingrained in our politics, in our education system. I mean, think of the big theories in psychology. Think of Freud, think of the social learning theorists, think of behaviorism. They all point to things outside of the organism in order to understand the organism. Freud said that when we get stuck in certain psychosexual conflicts, depending on the time that it happens, it has these consequences. The social learning theorists, who we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, their central statement is we become the people that we are because we are exposed to certain role models, okay, in our lives. We learn from them, okay, and we aspire to be them. So if you're a female who lives with a working mother, then those females tend to have vocational aspirations that are different, for example, than females who grew up with non-working moms. But again, the emphasis is on the what happens in the experience of the individual. Even if you think, no, I don't believe that, I never bought into that idea, I can pretty much promise you that you'll fall victim to the idea. This usually happens when you have your first child. Yeah, you hold your child, you're madly in love with your child in a way that nobody can explain to you, and you think to yourself, consciously, unconsciously, whatever, if I just do the right thing as a mom, okay, then the world will be my kid's oyster. And you might find yourself doing weird and wacky things like sitting in community center basements with your 3-month-old listening to Mozart, okay? Or putting your kid in a program to do something that comes from the parenting industry because you want your kid to have a good head start. You might contemplate spending $37,000 to put them in a private school for kindergarten. Okay, it's deeply ingrained in us. All right, and the idea that individual variation is partially responsible, is partially due to genetic factors, is completely antithetical to that idea. And the other concern, and this, of course, is a legitimate concern, is our concern that regarding the potential for misuse. Like those of you who have done 23andMe or Ancestry, I'm sure you have wondered who has access to your genomic information. Okay, that could be worrisome. We have concerns that genetic information could be used in ways that discriminate against people or that hurt people. We don't have to go too far back in history, okay, to find instances where there was an idea that a certain group of people are inferior to everybody else, okay? And that somehow justifies throwing them into gas chambers and annihilating them. Okay, we had a wholesale industrial genocide of Jewish people not that long ago. All right, this is obviously a very legitimate concern. Scientists aren't policymakers. All right, and we have to deal with this information, obviously, in a very responsible way. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at what this field addresses and some of the methods that they employ. The field of behavior genetics is a merger between biology, between genetics in particular, and psychology. All right. If you're sitting on a plane and the person next to you tells you that they are a behavior geneticist, and you say, well, what does that mean? What do you folks do? They'll probably give you an answer that sounds something like this. They focus on differences between people, individual differences. Okay, so you look out in the real world. Some kids have learning disabilities. Some kids do really well at school. Some teenagers are super shy, some are big risk takers, and so on. People are different. They focus on these differences between individuals, and the major Oh, can you not see the slides now, Yasmin? No? Oh my gosh. Okay, hang on a second. I have to go out and then come back in all the time. Does that work? Can you see it now? Methods and behavior. Okay, so I only went through one slide. The major question for these folks is the degree to which heredity and the environment determine these differences. Do not be misled by the name of the field. Okay. If someone tells you they're a behavior geneticist, it doesn't mean they're only interested in genetic factors. The theories from behavior genetics, the methodologies from behavior genetics tell you just as much about the role of the environment as they tell you about the role of genes. Okay. Some people have argued that this is a very powerful approach to understanding human behavior. Other people have found it questionable. I'll critically evaluate it later in the lecture. Okay. Not surprising that it started in the animal laboratories. Okay. Field started in with animal research. Why? Because for better or worse, probably worse, we can experimentally manipulate genes or hereditary factors and the environment in animals without the same ethical considerations that would apply to humans. Okay. And most behavior genetics studies that you'll encounter in the literature are a variation on the theme of these two approaches on the slide. Okay. What are known as selective breeding and inbreeding. And let me just break those down for you now. We can, in an experimental context, selectively breed for a trait by continuously breeding males and females who are high on some trait with one another, okay? And males and females we can breed males and females who are low on that trait with one another, okay? Putting them in the same environmental conditions and then looking to see how much they differ. So I'll give you an example here. Imagine we have two mouse pups, okay? Mouse pup A comes from a long line of aggressive relatives. All right? You can do that with mice. In a group of mice, you can pluck out the most aggressive male, pluck out the most aggressive female, put them in a cage together. They will breed. You can keep doing this over many generations, and that doesn't take long with mice to do that. Okay, we can do that. So let's say we did that for 10 generations. We've got mouse pup right here that comes from a long line of aggressive family members. We have mouse pup over here in our other hand that comes from a long line of, what's the opposite of aggression? Passive family members. Okay, so you take the least aggressive male and the least aggressive female, put them in a cage, breed. You do this over and over and over, over many generations. Okay, they're pups. We put them each in separate cages. Those cages are identical. We give them the same food. We give them the same amount of water. We control the temperature so that it's the same for both of them. The same handler goes in to clean the cage every couple of days and so on. All right, so we raise them in identical environmental conditions. Then when they're grown up, and that doesn't take too long in mice, all right, we put them in a boxing ring, okay, and we watch their behavior. And if we observe that mouse A is indeed more aggressive than mouse B, then what can we say about where aggression comes from? Good, excellent, okay. Then we have evidence that aggression is attributable to some extent to hereditary factors. So in selective breeding, we vary heredity. We did that by forcing aggressive individuals to mate with one another. And then we held the environment constant. We can also, as humans, and we do this a fair bit or a variation of this with non-human animals, we can also inbreed animals. Now, animals in nature don't breed with first-degree relatives, okay? But if you give them no other breeding partner, they will breed with first-degree relatives. And researchers used to do this, and they would end up with litters of mice that were virtually identical to one another genetically. Now you don't have to do that. Now you can buy, and they're really inexpensive too. Now you can buy cloned mice. Okay, you can buy animals that are 100% genetically identical. So let's say as a class project, we did that. We bought 10 of them. Okay. We took them to the lab in the behavioral science building at Kiel campus, and we divided them into two groups. Okay, we have two cages. Put five genetically identical mice in one cage and the other five in another. Everything about the way we raise them is the same, except for one thing. Okay, every day the mice in cage A get taken out of the cage and they get to fool around and play on a maze, a radial maze or a T maze. These are like mouse IQ tests, so that if they solve the maze, they get a treat, and then you put them back at the original starting point. Every day at 2:30 for half an hour or an hour, whatever, we let the mice from group A have some time on the maze. And then 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later, whatever it is, we run a maze running Olympics with our mice. If we observe that team A outperforms team B in maze running ability, then what can we say about where maze running ability comes from? What would you conclude? Yes, you would conclude that in this example, it comes from the environment, practice in particular. Okay, so in inbreeding, heredity stays constant and the environment is manipulated by you, the experimenter. We do variations of stuff like this with non-human animals all the time. Anyone here who has a purebred dog knows that when you go to a breeder, okay, to buy a puppy, the first thing you want to see, what do you want to see when you go to a breeder to buy a purebred dog? Any purebred dog owners here? Here? You want to see the pedigree, exactly. You want to look at the parents. I'll tell you a little story that kind of made this real for me. Many years ago, we decided to get a lab puppy, a Labrador Retriever puppy, as a pet. Okay, just as a pet. Went to this breeder. Well, how can you not fall in love with any puppies? Labrador Retriever puppies are pretty cute. We said, "Yep, we'll take one of these." When we went to pick him up at 8 weeks, the breeder said, "You know what? Bring this dog back in a couple of months. I think he's going to turn out nice." And we were like, "Okay, whatever. We'll drive out to visit the breeder again." So we did. And when we took him, she put him on this table and she's feeling him and she's looking in his mouth and she's measuring stuff and so on. And she said, "This dog meets the breed standard brilliantly. I'd like to show him." And we said, well, you're not taking our dog to dog shows. We're not giving you our dog to show him. But if there are any dog shows in and around where we live, we'll let you show them. We thought it would just be fun. And it is the weirdest subculture ever, like the dog show subculture. It really is like that movie with Eugene Levy. What is that movie called? Best in Show. Okay. And in no time at all, this dog started racking up points. He was like third in Canada before he was a year old. Well, when you have a dog, okay, that's third in Canada in this dog show world, your phone starts ringing off the hook. Who's calling? People who want to breed their bitch to your dog. So we're like, what is happening here? We told the breeder, and the breeder made it very clear to us that she would be interested in breeding Willie, but that she gets to make the decision, okay, on who to breed the dog with. And that's when you get into the mindset of the dog breeders, okay? Because they see money when they see your dog. To us, he was just the most wonderful pet. We adored him, but to her, okay, she was thinking of her livelihood. So she's motivated to breed the dog with like if you have this dog that has certain phenotypic characteristics, then and that are prized in the dog show world, then you want to keep those characteristics in, okay? Breed it to a female that has those characteristics. You don't want to breed it to a close relative because you don't want two-headed puppies, but they're highly motivated to engage in what's known as line breeding. They breed them to relatives that share the same traits. Those are the people who share the same traits, your relatives, okay? Which is why all purebred dogs suffer from some kind of medical disorder. It is the result of not inbreeding, but what's known as line breeding. Okay. Now, obviously, yes, what a business. Exactly, Casey Joe. Now, obviously, we can't manipulate genes in the environment with humans in the way that we can with animals, but there are a number of naturally occurring events that simulate in humans that simulate these conditions that we can produce in the lab. And behavior geneticists have been doing all kinds of things. One of the first things that they did, and everybody's heard of this somewhere, was to look at how traits run in families. Okay, so imagine, I'm going to look, oops, get the whiteboard now here. Imagine that we have, a group of identical twins. I'll share this with you in a second. Got a group of identical twins. Any identical twins in the class? No. Identical twins who are reared together in the same household, yeah. And as a class project, we are interested in looking at the degree of resemblance between them on some personality trait. Let's say shyness. Okay, we're asking the question: to what extent do identical twins who are reared together, how similar are they to one another on shyness. So we locate the world's greatest shyness questionnaire. Yeah. We give it to our twin pairs. And then to look at the degree of association between them, what statistic would we use, folks? Want to know something about the association between our twins, the degree of similarity between them, how similar they are to one another. Okay, I can't see the chat, so just blurt it out because it'll mess up my thing. What do we look at? What statistic do we look at? Just say, somebody.
Correlation?
Thank you, Mia. We look at the correlation between our twin pair performance on the shyness questionnaire. So we calculate the correlation coefficient, and we obtain an R, of, let's say, positive, positive 0.60. Now, that's a pretty big correlation coefficient. Okay, you don't find that in psychology very frequently. What can we conclude now? We've got twin pairs, they share 100% of their genes. What can we conclude on the basis of this number about where shyness comes from? What could we say? Don't know in the chat. How does it do that? How do I make this smaller? It just takes up my whole thing here. Oh, there we go. What could we say? Yasmin, suggesting that we conclude that it's largely hereditary. Everybody agree with her? Yes. Anybody think no? Okay, Casey Joe, opposing view. You say no because why? Etty, Casey Joe, you say no because why?
Because I want to think that the environment also played a role in the
because you want
shyness.
to think?
I want to.
Okay. Eddie?
Yeah, same, because they were rare together. We don't know how many percentage it was the hereditary and what was the percentage of the environment.
Okay, so if we just look at this number, we can't say really much about where they come from. Why? Again, identical twins share 100% of their genes, so maybe we got this great big whopping correlation coefficient because of the role of genetic factors. But they're also living together in the same household. They're also being raised together in the same family. So maybe we get this big correlation coefficient because they're being raised together. It could be the environment. All right. Genes run in families and environments run in families. And there's no way to tease them apart. Okay. If we just look at our methodology. So what happened was that researchers turned to a human analogy of selective breeding, okay, where heredity varies and the environment is held constant. So we don't want to give up on our project. You can still see my correlation coefficient on the screen, okay? What we could do would be to grab a group of fraternal twins, okay, different kinds of twin pairs, fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes with one another, just like regular siblings. We grab a sample of fraternal twins who are raised together. Okay, we give them the world's greatest shyness questionnaire. We calculate the correlation coefficient between fraternal twin pairs, and we obtain a correlation coefficient this time of positive 0.45, let's say. Can we say anything now? If you find a significant difference in the relationship between identical twins reared together and fraternal twins reared together, and we have here, okay, that's a big difference between those numbers, then we're starting to get some evidence that heredity plays a role in the development of that trait because the environment within each group of twin pairs is controlled. Okay, they're living in the same environment. So now we're starting to cook, all right, in terms of interpreting, being able to interpret things. But we wouldn't rush to present this at a conference. There's a few problems here. I don't know, can anybody would anybody criticize this methodology here or poke some holes in it?
You're only going by two examples, and if you really wanted to be completely sure that there was a hereditary part of it, I would also look at identical twins that were raised separately as
You're
well
way ahead of me. I don't know who's talking here, but you're way ahead of me. Yeah, this is what we've got. Okay, for now, I'm going there. I don't know who was speaking, but I am going there. Okay, one of the problems interpreting the difference between these two numbers here has to do with the fact that fraternal twins can be different sexes. Yeah. And we know from all kinds of places in psychology that from the moment of birth, males and females are treated differently. They're spoken to differently by their parents, they're handled differently by mothers and fathers, and so on. Their environment is anything but constant. So let's say, okay, we understand that. We'll take out all of our different sex fraternal twins. Even if these correlation coefficients stayed, all right, there's another problem here, and that's that we know, again, from different places in psychology, that identical twins are treated much more similarly to one another than fraternal twins are. You just look in the real world and you can see this. Parents dress identical twins identically. They treat them similarly. Fraternal twins grow up and live in a much more differentiated environment than identical twins do. So another approach, let's go back to them. What behavior geneticists did, another approach that they used. Can you see the PowerPoint slide now? Yes? No? Just say yes. You can see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Was to look at the flip side of this, to look at individuals who are raised in the same environment, but who share different genes. When do you have this? You have this in families with adopted children. Okay, the logic is super straightforward here. All right, you take adopted children, you compare them, you look at the degree of similarity between their kids and their adoptive parents on some psychological trait, and you compare that degree of similarity between those kids and their biological parents. And people said, well, okay, the logic is straightforward, but this has flaws too, okay? Adopted kids are almost never adopted out at exactly the same time. Sometimes they're adopted out immediately after birth, sometimes after it's a couple of years. There's no way to control for the amount of time infants spend with their biological parents, and this could have an effect, okay? Another problem identified in early adoption studies came from some very important work by, I'll put his name in the chat, by Leon Kamen, who actually looked at how adoption agencies make decisions about which families to place adopted kids into. And he found that kids are adopted to families that are very, very similar to their biological parents. Okay? And that creates an obvious interpretation problem. All right, so also flaws associated with this method. And then came the big moment, the big watershed moment in the 80s, sort of early to mid 80s, when researchers at the University of Minnesota had amassed at that time about 40 pairs of identical twins who'd been separated at birth, okay? And then, usually through some bizarre set of circumstances, were later reunited. Okay, now I think last time I checked, they have about 200 pairs in their registry. So researchers started to plots. Okay, they were fainting with excitement. Why? Because this is the perfect experiment. And you've all seen them. I know that they were on the talk show circuits, endless documentaries about them, and they are amazing to watch. You know, you see two guys sitting on Oprah's couch and they look identical to one another, and turns out they lived 7 miles away from one another, ran into each other at a 7-Eleven, and they're both firemen, and they're both married to redheads named Trixie, and they both have beagles as canine pets. And you watch them, and you know, your jaw drops, your hand goes to your chest, you gasp. The similarities are astonishing. Now, if you have access, all right, to identical twins who were reared apart, then you test them on everything, okay? And that's what happened to these twin pairs in Minnesota. Every psychological test that we have has been administered to these twin pairs. This is the human analogy of inbreeding, yeah, where the environment varies and heredity is held constant. You have this condition whenever siblings are reared apart from birth. But the most precise case, of course, is when you have identical twins who are reared apart. I don't think that it's legal anymore to separate identical twins, like to adopt them out to different families. Any significant relationship between identical twins who are reared apart is evidence for the role of heredity. Okay, so the researchers at the University of Minnesota, they're super excited. I mean, they put out amazing work with these twin pairs. And I put this quote up just to give you a sense of how excited everybody was when this stuff started to come out. So again, the field has gone from asking, are there any traits that are influenced by genes, to now, largely as a result of their work, to asking the question, are there any traits that aren't influenced by genes? Okay. Now, since this time, there have emerged a number of criticisms of the approach, and some new nifty research findings from other fields that have raised some questions about the interpretation of data from behavior genetic studies. And that's where I'm going to go now. Okay. Most of the criticisms bear on how we think of the environment, quote unquote. Okay. So we're going to look at some problems with twin study methods. Problem one has to do with the fact that identical twins don't always share the same environment. Okay. In fetal life, okay, before organisms are born, If identical twins split during the first 5 days after fertilization, after conception, each one gets its own placenta. That's what you see on the right-hand side of the screen here. Okay, we call this a bichorionic environment. And that happens in about 1/3 of twin pregnancies. If they split after days 1 to 5, okay, following fertilization, they share a placenta. They share this the same environment. We call this a monochorionic environment. Why is that relevant? Well, obviously, in both situations, the twins share the same mom, mother's blood supply, and so on. But new techniques have allowed people to go in and investigate the fetal environment. And what they've found is that there are differences in nutrient levels, okay, the amount of nutrition and food that the twins get in bichorionic environments. They actually compete with one another. It's very bizarre stuff. But the point here is that their environments are not identical. And you say, well, that's nifty, but how important could that very subtle difference be to what we're talking about here? And the answer to that is sometimes really important. Okay, so we know that identical twins, for example, from monochorionic pregnancies, after they're born, when you monitor them, when you measure their IQ developmentally, they have more similar IQs than twins who occupied different placentas. All right, so the environment is not something that begins at birth. There's a prenatal environment that can play a powerful role. And when we observe similarities between identical twins and we conclude, oh, it must be due to genetic factors, we have to look at this period of time before they're born before we can say that with confidence. Other evidence for the role of the prenatal environment comes from animal studies, which there's a huge body of research showing that prenatal hormones exert all kinds of predictable effects on psychological traits. So when you look at rats, for example, rats have litters of about 10 to 12 pups. When you look at the placental circulatory system, which I put on the slide here, you have this weird kind of loopy structure. And the environment, if you're a female, okay, in this structure, in this placental structure here, that's situated between two brothers, you live in a very different hormonal environment. This is all before you're born, okay? Than your sister who's living between two sisters, or your sister who's living between a brother and a sister. Why? Because you're exposed to much higher levels of testosterone. We know that testosterone can pass through the fetal membranes. Okay, so if you have two adjacent male litter mates, you're living in a different quote unquote environment. And when you follow those rat pups up later, there are all kinds of behavioral differences. Female rats that grew up placentally in between two brothers are way more masculinized, quote unquote, than their sisters who grew up between two sisters. They reach puberty sooner, okay? They show more aggression. There are all kinds of behavioral differences that can be traced to the prenatal environment, okay? And finally, I'll put this up just for fun because some of you might find yourselves living this in the near future. It's also been demonstrated that learning can occur in utero. So if you take a pregnant rat and you inject sucrose into her placenta, it'll be consumed by the fetus. And then afterwards, if you give those newborns a choice between sugar water and regular water, they'll drink from the sugar water. So there's tons of stuff going on prenatally before we're born, okay, and before birth. And whenever we see greater similarity between identical twins, it may be because they share 100% of their genes, okay? But in many cases, they also share a prenatal environment, and we can't tease apart those effects. Okay, put a line in your notes. I'm going to go somewhere different here. Behavior, as I mentioned earlier, behavior geneticists aren't just interested in whether genes play a role, yes or no, okay, in the development of a behavioral trait, but they're also interested in determining the degree to which genes in the environment influence variation, okay? And the concept that is used to describe that is the concept of heritability. Lots of controversy associated with this concept, mainly because the way geneticists use the word is different than the way we use it in everyday language. A couple of things I want you to note in your notes now. In genetics, heritability, all right, symbolized here on the slide by h squared, is a descriptive statistic, just like the mean, just like the median, just like the mode, and so on. It's a descriptive statistic that is a ratio of variances. Okay? So when you look at variation on a trait, it can only come from one of two places. It can come from genes or it can come from the environment. Okay, so it asks the question, how much of the phenotypic variability that we observe in a trait, like what we can see, can be accounted for by genotypic variability? How many? What are you doing in your stats course right now? Those of you who are taking stats, are you doing analysis of variance yet? Who's taking stats right now? Who has already taken stats? Guessing there are some of you. Okay, if there's nobody here who's taken stats yet? Stats 2? Stats 2? And we're working on t-tests. Okay. So you're not there yet. Those of you soon, okay, you'll be doing what's known as an analysis of variance that allows you in an experimental situation, if you look at the F ratio, it allows you to determine how much of the variability in an experiment is due to your treatment and how much of it is due to error. This has the same kind of logic. Okay? So when we observe putting this in everyday language, when we observe variation in people, it can only come from genetic influences or environmental influences. In everyday non-statistical terminology, the heritability concept addresses the following question. How much of the, let's say, similarity between two individuals on some trait is based on similar heredity? This is a very, very poorly misunderstood concept. So let me make a couple of points here. Let me highlight a couple of points so you never make a mistake in interpreting heritability estimates. Okay. This one. Can somebody tell me how I get my whiteboard? I don't. Layout, pause, annotate. Where did the whiteboard function go on Zoom?
It might be under more if you have the three dots at the
Yeah, I'm
bottom.
looking at more, and do you know where the whiteboard function is? I'm just asking my consultants here.
What's on the annotate? What's that?
Annotate, I have to. Oh, that looks like the thing for. Hmm. Yeah, why is it? Usually it's under more. It'd be really hard for me to show this without a.
Do you think that there's like a whiteboard that's already open somehow? I don't know if that would be true. Like, is it like maybe at a folder at the top of your Zoom by chance?
I tried. I have the button for it, and I tried clicking existing whiteboards, and it says that you can't open a whiteboard during screen share. So I don't know if that might.
Oh, hang on a second. Hang on. I'll stop the share. Maybe that's it. Let's go to more. Whiteboard. Awesome. Okay. And there's my whiteboard.
You can see your screen, can you?
But they can't see my screen
Yeah,
now.
fill that up.
So where's the, oh, it's loading now.
There,
Use the classic.
there.
Okay,
It'll
can you
share-
see the white?
No,
Oh,
you
no,
can see
you
it.
can't see it. No, they are. I am
Okay, then.
sharing it.
All
Can you
right.
see the whiteboard now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Problem solved. All right, so I've got two distributions here. Thank you for whoever put me onto that. I've got distribution A. Doesn't matter what we're talking about here for trait A. And with a mean of mean. And I've got distribution B here. Oops. Okay. Talk to me about these two distributions. In what ways are they the same? In what ways are they different? Just speak, because if I open the chat now, then I won't be able to see anything. I've got two distributions with the same mean. Yeah, these line up.
With
Oh,
a oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go,
with a
go, go.
different standard deviation.
With different variances. Yeah. Okay. Standard deviation is just the square root of the variance. All right. Distribution A, this one here, is way more spread out than distribution B. Okay. Now, write this down in bold letters. The heritability coefficient does not tell you how much genes have to do with the average level of a trait. Okay. It has nothing to do with the mean or measures of central tendency. It tells you how much genes have to do with this, okay? The variability of a trait, which is high for distribution A and much smaller for distribution B. All right, that is why, stop sharing.
Professor, can you repeat?
That is why the heritability estimate is always specific to a certain population and a certain environment that you're looking at. I'm going to make this point when we look at data later on. You can see my PowerPoint slide now. Again, I'm looking at you, Etty. Just nod yes or no. You can see. Okay. This has the heritability estimate has nothing to do with you individually. Okay. It's not an individual parameter. It's a population parameter. Okay, let's keep going here. Now, the simplest index of heritability is this formula on the top of the screen. All right, the correlation between identical twins reared apart. Any amount of similarity between identical twins, behavior geneticists used to do this, reared apart, gives you an estimate of heritability. But there's a problem with using this formula. And I've told you the problem already that was raised by an observation made by Leon Kamen. When you look at the environments of identical twins who are reared apart, very frequently they are correlated on some dimensions. And if there is a relationship between the environments of those identical twins reared apart, then this number up here, okay, this first number, is going to give you a pumped up, inflated overestimate of the role of hereditary factors. Okay, which is why, and your textbook points this out, which is why most of the time behavior geneticists use this formula here. And if you have a math aptitude, this will make all the sense in the world. If you don't have a math aptitude, that's perfectly fine. But what you need to know from me is that this is a safer formula than the top one, okay? Because most of the time, you can never be certain that the environments of identical twins reared apart are uncorrelated. And it would be perfectly acceptable and fine for me to, on the exam, give you so you look at this formula, yeah, you just subtract the relationship between fraternal twins raised together from the R for identical twins raised together and multiply by 2. It would be perfectly acceptable, I'm winking now, yeah, in the camera, for me to give you 2 numbers and ask you to calculate the heritability coefficient. Are you with me? Okay. Okay. Second one is better than the first one. Okay, one more criticism before we take a break here. And stop the share and find that whiteboard again. There we go. New whiteboard. Okay. Stop. Okay. There have been many criticisms of the behavior genetic approach, but I want to point out one important one today that is best taught by an example. All right. So you're taking, can you see my screen? Can you see the whiteboard? Yeah. You're taking a botany course at York. And you're interested in a particular plant species. And you want to know, let's say, whether there is a relationship between genes and height in that plant. Super simple experiment, yeah? Is there a relationship between genetic factors and height in this plant species that you've fallen in love with? So you go to the store, you go to Sheridan Nursery, and you buy a packet of seeds that has 3 genetic variants of that plant. Okay. And you walk over to the beautiful greenhouse behind the behavioral sciences building. And you say, can I plant my seeds in your greenhouse? And they say, yeah, sure. They give you a little plot of soil. Okay. And you take your packet of seeds that have 3 types of genetic variants, A, B, and C. You plant them in that little plot of soil. And let's say they tell you they'll take care of them for you. Water them, they'll make sure they get enough light, they'll feed your plants, and so on. All right. And you show up 60 days later to observe the height of plants for those 3 genetic variants. Okay. And let's pretend that this is what you see. All right, so on this axis, the vertical axis, it's height. So here we go. The mean height for genetic variant A looks like this. B looks like this. C looks like this. Okay, so remember, you've asked the question, do genes have anything to do with height? Okay, does the trait differ as a function of the genetic variant? Knowing what gene the plant has allows you, looking at this data here, predictive power in determining height. You look at this and you say, yeah, the variability in mean height that I've observed has everything to do with genes. You'd say there's a high heritability estimate for the trait height. So imagine this tickles your fancy and there's an undergraduate conference somewhere close by and you think your data's worth showing and you get on the TTC and you strike up a conversation with another person who's going to the same conference, and it turns out they've done exactly the same experiment that you have, okay, with the same 3 genetic variants. And you're like, get out, show me your data, okay? So that person opens their laptop, and when they open their laptop, they tell you, oh yeah, I used the same genetic variants, but I planted my seeds somewhere else. I planted my seeds in Macedonia, okay? Let's pretend. All right, and they open up their laptop, and this is what their data looks like. Now, what's your impression now? You both asked the same question. Do genes influence height? But you run into another researcher who's doing this exactly the same experiment in a different environment, all right, with the same 3 genetic variants, and they get this. They made the same conclusion that you did, okay? But when you put your data next to their data, you both asked, what does this gene have to do with height? And you said it has a lot to do with height. But when you compare between groups, you see that the environment is way more important than you thought when you just looked at your own data, or when they just looked at their own data. When you look between groups, you get a completely different impression than if you looked within each group. Within each group, the environment is the same. Okay, so you walk away concluding that the differences that you observed are due to genetic differences. And that's the problem with most behavior genetics research. They don't look at the effect of genes in different environments. They control for the environment. And you say, well, wait a minute, I thought that was a good thing. They told me in my research methods that it's important to control environmental variables. It's important to control for things. And that's true. But in behavior genetics studies, when you control for the environment, you essentially eliminate the possibility that you will discover its role. Okay? Which is why you can, and I put this in capitals, because this is where behavior genetics findings are grotesquely misused. You cannot make inferences about between group differences. okay, between different groups of people, let's say, on the basis, you can't study traits within groups of people and then make inferences about between group differences. That's a better way to say it. Okay, and that's where this stuff is grotesquely misused. It's always, the heritability estimate is always specific to a certain sample, to a certain time, and to a certain place. And I'm going to show you data after the break to make that point. Any questions? Hi, Eddie. Got your hand up?
Yes, I do. So one question with the example that we had right now, within groups would be the two different data that two students had or researchers had?
No. Within groups is what you did. You had 3 groups and you made comparisons within them, and all of them were in the same environment.
Mhm.
And you walk away from yours, okay, the red bars, and you go, oh yeah, gene, if I know what gene the plant comes from, it allows me to predict the average height. Okay, you'd say for sure, height has to do with genes. But when you compare your study with the same study done in a different environment,
Mhm.
oh my goodness, the mean height for groups A, B, and C are really different across the different environments. You see that environment plays a much more powerful role than you would have concluded just looking at your own. That was the point.
Perfect. So group A to my study, group A to his study, group A to B
Completely different, yeah.
in groups.
Okay, and that's where people misuse the statistic. They use it to make um, inferences about differences between groups of people. Okay, terrible writing that I could give you some samples where people have done this. Makes no sense at all.
Perfect.
Okay, I've got 8:25. Let's take 10. We'll come back, and I promise you that's it for methods and stats. We'll look at some data. Okay. Okie doke. So just to recap, heritability estimates are always specific to time and place. I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about here. As I mentioned before, researchers who had access to these identical twins who were reared apart generated mountains of data, okay, on the heritability of psychological traits. And of all of the traits that they've studied, IQ consistently shows the highest degree of heritability. That does not mean that IQ, at least as it's measured on the IQ test, was particularly important in our evolution. Okay, because if you've ever seen the IQ test and what it measures, you look at that and you say, no, those skill sets would not have been particularly relevant to matters of survival or reproduction. One interesting and very, very unexpected finding that emerged during behavior genetic studies of IQ, is the fact that the heritability coefficient increases as subjects get older from about middle childhood through to late adolescence. Okay, and I've put some data on the slide here that shows you this. What does that mean? It means in everyday language that when you're looking, for example, at adopted children, okay, as adopted kids get older, their resemblance in IQ to their adopted families decreases, and their resemblance to their biological family members in IQ increases. Nobody really understands why that is. And could anybody venture a guess as to why that might be observed? Why do we see that? I want to look at the chat, but I want to.
Why this happens? Like why?
Yeah, why does that happen? Genetics kicking in, Casey Joe? Yeah, meaning, what do you mean by that?
I suppose as you age and mature and evolve, maybe you're more likely to have your predisposition genetics override whatever environmental factors might have existed
Yeah,
prior to that.
but that's a viable theory that a lot of people have subscribed to, okay, that genetic effects on intelligence actually turn on later. They manifest later, which, by the way, is entirely congruent with the ideas of the great developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, who proposed that different capacities that are related to intelligence emerge at different developmental stages. But the thing to note here in connection with this slide is that the heritability estimate is not a static number. Okay? Again, it depends on when you take the measurement. When you look at genetic effects on personality traits, for the most part, they hover between 0.4 and 0.5. So I'll show you some, and again, there's a great deal of data. I'll show you some data here on this slide of the heritability estimates for the big five. Okay. Extroversion 0.54, agreeableness 0.42, openness, which we said last week is the most controversial of the factor of the 5-factor models, the one that's most difficult to replicate cross-culturally, shows a heritability estimate of 0.57. Nobody expected these numbers in psychology. Okay, they thought the numbers would be 0. All right, if you believe that everything about the person, including their personality, comes from the environment, then you would predict heritability estimates in or around 0. But nobody found, like, in none of the studies are the heritability estimates near 0. Okay, they're on average around 0.4. And this was a shocker to mainstream behavioral scientists. Now, some time ago, researchers by the name of Plomin and Daniels, I uploaded a Plomin video, a video by Robert Plomin. I designated it as mandatory viewing for this session. I want you to watch that. But when this stuff started to come out in the late 1980s, Plomin and Daniels reviewed all of the behavior genetics literature on personality traits and came up with a rather remarkable conclusion, okay, that I think is taught best by example. So let's go back to our class project, okay, where we collected data on the similarity between identical twins raised together on, what did we say? Shyness. Okay, let's go back to that. Let's go back to that data. Okay. We calculated this, right? And when I asked you, what does this tell us? You said, well, not a lot, okay? There's problems here because when you look at identical twin, the degree to which identical twins who've been raised together resemble one another, everything's all mixed up. Okay, the role of genetic factors and environmental factors is all mixed up. So imagine now that we want to keep going with this project, and we called up Tommy Bouchard in Minnesota and said, hey, can we have some of your identical twins reared apart? Because we want to give them the world's greatest shyness questionnaire. And he says, yeah, okay, I'll send them up right away. And we bring them into the lab and we give them the same world's greatest shyness questionnaire. And we look at the degree of correspondence between them. Okay. What would you expect this number to be in relation to this number? I'm hoping you can see my cursor. What would you expect the correlation for identical twins raised apart to be relative to the correlation coefficient we obtained for identical twins raised together, just on the basis of common sense, just on the basis of everything they taught us at school? What would you predict? Would you predict that number to be higher than, lower than this number? What would you say? I'm going to wait for some of you to guess. You'd say lower, Sarah, because why? Lower, yeah, Shabnam. Because why? You would predict that. I know that you would predict that.
I missed what we are looking at, the number for.
Okay, so we identified the problems here.
Mhm.
Okay, looking in making inferences about the role of genes in the environment when we compare identical twins raised together. So we grab ourselves a sample of identical twins who've been reared apart, and we give them the same questionnaire. And most of the students here have said, well, don't know what the number would be, but would predict that this number would be lower than this number. And that makes sense. You say, yeah, in both instances, identical twins share 100% of their genes, but there must be something about living together with the same parents and the same environment that contributes to their similarity in shyness. But when Plomin and Daniel reviewed the literature, what they found is that this number is either exactly the same or negligibly different. And I want you to just think about that now. Identical twins who've been raised apart, who've had nothing to do with one another growing up, show just as much similarity between twin pairs as identical twins who've been raised in the same household. What does that mean? It doesn't matter which trait, Eddie. We're talking about shyness, but to make the point, it doesn't matter what it means. Genes play more of a role, okay, when considering shyness, genetics. Right, that's what students usually say. It's not, but they're wrong, okay? It's not that there's no effective environment. If there were no effective environment, what would this number be? What would the R be?
100.
That's right. It would be a perfect positive one. It's not a perfect positive one. It's never a perfect positive one. Okay? Now, it's a lot higher than people thought, but it's not one. So it doesn't mean that there's no effective environment. What it means is that there's no effect of what behavior geneticists call shared environment. Okay? Being raised in the same household going to the same schools, having the same socioeconomic resources, same extended kinship network, same religious influences, and so on. Okay? Think of all the things you shared with your brothers and sisters. Those shared environmental influences don't seem to have anything to do with personality. Okay? And there are two independent lines. Are you with me? And there are two independent lines of evidence to support the idea that the common rearing environment, all those things you did share with your siblings, has very little influence on self-reported personality factors. Okay, line of evidence number one, I just showed you. Okay, the similarity and correlations between identical twins who are reared apart and reared together. By the way, the same thing is observed in fraternal when you compare fraternal twins who are reared together versus fraternal twins reared apart. They're just as like one another, okay, when they're reared apart as when they're reared together. Line of evidence number two comes from data showing that individuals who are reared together, all right, so think of your siblings now, people you're biologically related to, and for many of you, people who you grew up in the same household with. There's a great deal of data showing that siblings actually show very little resemblance to one another on most personality traits. And I'm guessing that you did not need me to tell you that. Yeah, we kind of know this. So right now, think of your closest aged sibling. I think I put this in as a reflection question, but we can talk about it now. Think of your closest aged sibling. If I asked you the question, are you more similar to or different than that sibling on some, let's say, global personality measure? How many of you would say, oh, I'm more similar to my closest age sibling? Put up your hands. Not one. Great. If I asked you, how many of you are more different than your closest age siblings? Put up your hand. Right. Okay. We know this. We observe this all the time. Again, it doesn't mean that the environment isn't important, all right? It just means that those environmental influences that are important are all influences that you don't share with your siblings. Okay, they're all of an unshared type. Idiosyncratic factors and experiences that families members do not share. So at this point, we really have to ask the question. It makes all the sense in the world to ask the question. Got this, my PowerPoint back up. Can you see it, Eddie? Can you? Yeah, okay. We have to ask the question, how did psychology get it so wrong? How did we get it so wrong for so long? Why is there this huge disconnect between our theories and the data from behavior genetics? When you think of the big sweeping theories that you have encountered in psychology so far, in this course and in other places, they all differently, but they all highlight the role of the environment. Okay, what did Freud tell us? Freud told us that how the child navigates different psychosexual crises or challenges during development has long-term consequences for personality. Yeah. When you look at what the behavioral position on personality, to them, personality is nothing more than the accumulation of learned habits and experiences. It can all be traced to your learning environment. When you look at the social learning theories, when you look at the social cognitive theories, again, they emphasize different features of the environment, but they emphasize the role of the environment. And that is not what the behavior genetics studies are showing us. Think of all that stuff that you learned in developmental psychology about the effects of parenting. Authoritative parents make better kids or better adjusted kids than authoritative or permissive parents. All of those relationships that you interfaced with about the effects of parenting on later development. The behavior genetics data are antithetical to all of these models. Judith Rich Harris wrote this wonderful book some time ago called The Nurture Assumption, where she reviewed the evidence and actually at the end made the claim that parents don't matter anywhere near what we've been told, okay, what we've been taught at school. And on my news feed today, I noticed just today, let me see if I can bring it up on the Free Press. There's an article. Maybe I can post it. Title of the article is "The Secret to Parenting." Don't do it. Okay, doesn't matter anywhere near as much as they told us it did. The secret to parenting: do less of it. Okay, because it really doesn't have a huge effect on most psychological traits. All right, so there's this huge disconnect between our theories and the data. And we can ask ourselves the question, well, why? How did that happen? And I'm going to entertain two possible explanations for this. Okay, so this is Phillips on why the disconnect, with a touch of Erwin Silverman because he influenced me. All right, so here's possibility number one. The empirical database from which most of our psychological theories arose typically involved researchers going into intact nuclear families to study individuals. So they'd go into people's homes where you have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters all living in the same dwelling, okay? And they would observe resemblances between family members. Oh, kids vote like their parents do. Oh, kids adopt the same religious traditions that their parents do. They have this, they share these values and so on and so forth. And when they observed similarities between family members, there was a striking tendency. I don't think it would be unfair to call it a systematic bias, but let's call it a striking tendency here to infer the importance of the environment, of environmental influences. Okay, and we identified the problem earlier in tonight's lecture. We said you can't go into intact nuclear homes and make any inferences because, yeah, environments run in families, but so do genes, okay? You're 50% related to your mother and your father and your siblings. There's no way to tease it apart. This speaks to the incredible influence of the blank slate doctrine in Western life. The idea that everything that the individual is born as a amorphous blob, and whenever you observe variation later, it's due to the influences of the environment, socialization factors, parenting practices, and so on and so forth. Okay, this held sway in our discipline of psychology for a very, very long time. Okay, and again, is deeply ingrained in our political philosophy, is deeply ingrained in our educational philosophy, and so on. So there was a bias to interpret resemblances between family members as reflecting the influence of the environment. The second possibility that really has to be considered here has to do with the fact, and again, this is something that we all know, that living in the same environment does not mean that all members live the same experience. Did you live the same life exactly as the siblings in your own house? You shared stuff, you shared the same food, the same number of books in the house, the same religious traditions, and so on. But were your experiences identical? No. Okay. Environmental factors like parenting style, like resource allocation, they're not the same. And this is so hard for parents, okay? But they're not the same for each child in the home. If you don't think parents allocate resources differently amongst their children, then just go down University Avenue and just pop into the courtrooms and watch first-degree relatives, siblings, fighting over estates, okay, viciously. Cottages are always contentious properties. Parents don't treat their kids identically. And that's a tough one to fess up to. I remember, I think of my mom as we were clamoring for her attention. She'd just throw her arms up and she'd say, "Don't you understand? I love you equally." And then she'd pause and then she'd say, "But differently." Not really understanding what an awesome behavior geneticist she was. How many of you feel that this is true of your own experiences? You weren't parented identically to all of your siblings. Okay, I'm looking at the chat now. Right. And psychologists failed to address this reality in their theories. Okay, Judith Rich Harris, back to her, in her conclusion that parents don't matter, identified a number of non-shared sources of variation that are much more influential on personality development. Okay, so think of all those things that you experienced differently than your siblings inside of the house and outside of the house. You are probably parented differently. Okay, when you're a parent for the first time, it's a certain kind of experience. The pacifier falls out of their mouth. There's a dog hair on it. You rush to stick it in boiling water. You sterilize it. Then you put it back in your kid's mouth. Second baby comes along, drops the pacifier. You do this, and then you stick it in their mouth. You are a different parent as a result of experience. For the second child than you are for the first child. What are some of the things that you can think of that are of a non-shared environmental influence that are likely really important in your personality? Anybody?
My friends.
Peer group. In that book, thanks, Michelle. In that book, she argues that peer influences are significantly more important in the development of a whole bunch of personality traits than parental influences. Think of the peer group you had growing up. You probably wouldn't be the same person if you had a different peer group. Maybe you had a mentor growing up that your siblings didn't have. Someone who cared about you, someone who took interest in you, maybe took you under their wing. Your developmental trajectory would not be the same if you didn't have that person. Birth order, okay? Birth order is another dimension that's an unshared source of variation that has enormous effects on personality. Think of the psychology of the firstborn. The firstborn is the only kid in the family that had it all and then had to share. Okay? Or as Alfred Adler put it, the only one to experience that feeling of being dethroned. That was his language. Okay. When you show behavior genetics data to family counselors, okay, when you show them to people who do therapy with families, they're never surprised by these data. They go, yeah, makes all the sense in the world. Because they see in their practices that the dynamics of the family actually force individuals to become different rather than similar. Sometimes you have to do that. If you're raising one kid to be a leader, unless you're Rose Kennedy, you can't force the rest of them to be a leader. You have to. You can put them down a different pathway. Okay, so our developmental theories are theories of parenting practices have a lot of catching up to do to incorporate these findings from the field of behavior genetics. It really did, with all of the methodological flaws that I outlined, these findings turned personality research upside down. Okay, I think I'm close to 9 o'clock. Oh, it's 9:02. Henny, Nisha, are you around? You here?
Yeah, we're both
Oh,
here.
awesome. Okay, hi, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
All right, not too bad. Okay, class, so I'm going to say goodbye. I'll see you next Tuesday night at Lassonde, whatever. I put it on E-class. Nisha, are you doing it solo tonight?
No, Henny's here.
Oh, Hanny's here too. Okay. So do I need to make one of you a co-host?
Yeah, if you don't mind making me co-host, because I think I'll probably share the slides. Is that okay,
I
Henny?
don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
at
That's
all.
perfect.
Okay. Hi, Hanny.
Hello.
And I think someone is just asking about the reflection question for today.
Oh, what about it? What's the question? I've got a million things open on my screen. Oh, how about the reflection question today? Is it not visible? Oh, it's hiding. Okay. I'll make it. I can leave here without everything crashing, right? I'll do that as soon as I leave here. Okay. Thanks for the heads up, Sarah. All right, take it away. Catch you later.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
And
Okay.
yes, it's recorded.
Yes.
Yeah, the recording's on.
All right. So I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so you can just see just the slides, right? Okay, amazing. Okay, so hi everyone. I can't believe we're already at close to midterm 2. I hope the semester is going well overall. You'll see that we posted the grades for the media reflection assignments today, the first one. So I know a few of you emailed reaching out, so just bear with us and we'll get back to you as soon as possible if you have any questions about that. But yes, for the midterm next week, same time, same thing as last time. We'll just kind of provide an overview of the chapters that will be covered on this midterm. So I'll do the first half-ish, and then Henny will do the second half. And then, yes, I believe that this is being recorded as well. Was there a question? Yeah.
Yeah, it's chapter 9. I thought it was chapter 14.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different just based on the like version or edition of the textbooks. It's the same content. So you'll see it's the exact same content. So it's the trait theories and then the what you covered in class today. So you'll see the content is the same. It's just the title of the chapter might be different based on the edition of the textbook because these slides are from last year.
Oh, you're using the old textbook.
Yeah, but again, the content is going to be the same. Okay, good question. Any other questions before we get started? Okay. So the first thing that we'll go over is just going over the trait theories of personality that you all have covered over the last couple of weeks. So just to get us started, really in terms of the trait theories of personality, the view of the person is considered to be kind of encompassed of two things. So the first being the physiological characteristics of an individual. And then the second thing, which is kind of more of what the focus of the chapter is psychological constructs. So this is kind of referred to as a trait construct. And so when we are talking about people, we'll commonly use some of these personality trait terms, right? So kind of how people are in terms of their temperament or the other things that we'll talk about later on in the slides. And these kind of two different types of patterns are seen as kind of enduring and consistent within an individual. Okay. So in terms of the trait concept, traits have two kind of different connotations, consistency and distinctiveness. So consistency refers to the fact that an individual might be predisposed to act a certain way or a dispositional construct. Okay. However, trait theorists do recognize that a person won't necessarily be trait consistent across all different constructs, right? Contexts. So we'll kind of talk about some of the things that might influence how an individual's traits displays across different contexts. And the second aspect of the second connotation is distinctiveness. And so this refers to the psychological characteristics that people differ in. Okay, so trait theorists explore these psychological characteristics. I'm seeing some things in the chat. Is there something?
Yeah, I'm monitoring the chat.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So distinctiveness refers to psychological characteristics that people differ in, or there might be significant differences across people. Okay, so there's little discussion in trait theories of some of these psychological abilities that are possessed by all people. So you won't see as much discussion on things like the universal capacity to use language or self-consciousness, things like that. It's more so kind of these traits that make people different from each other or distinct from each other. Okay, so in terms of the scientific functions that are actually served by trait constructs, theorists and researchers in this area might ask themselves the questions like, why theorize about these trait constructs? Okay, so trait constructs usually serve at least two, if not three, of these following scientific functions. So the textbook kind of goes into three different functions. So the first being description. Okay, so theories can describe how an individual or all different people act. Okay, so all personality trait theorists use trait constructs more descriptively to describe how people are. And so these traits might summarize a person's typical behavior and describe what they usually are like. And oftentimes this description kind of function is seen as the first step in any sort of scientific endeavor. Okay, so most trait theories don't seek to just describe individual people one at a time. How they oftentimes try to describe like an overall scheme of how people are. And so this is what a personality taxonomy refers to. Okay. And so later on in the slides, we'll talk about like different types of research that has been done to look at how larger groups of people function. The second kind of function that's served by a trait construct is prediction. So in this step, now we have a description or an understanding of what trait a particular individual or group of people has. Now we want to know whether knowing someone's personality can predict some sort of future behavior. So, for example, do scores on conscientiousness or the trait of conscientiousness, does it predict future does it predict whether you're a good employee or not in the future? Okay, so again, I'm sure that we've all done these kinds of tests or inventories or questionnaires like that in the past, where we might complete personality inventories to figure out what might be a good career choice for us, or what might be a good kind of degree to take in university. So that's kind of like a second function of trait constructs. Okay, so the third one is, okay, now we have a description of the person or the people. We've used it to predict, future behaviors. And now I want to understand kind of the why. So this refers to the explanation of things. And so this is when science explains the occurrence of things. And it could be, but not always, but it can be referred to as kind of like the causal explanation for a certain behavior. And so in this explanation kind of phase or function, oftentimes there is like a biological component, right? So for example, a biological factor such as cortisol levels might explain certain traits in an individual. Okay, whereas other types of factors might only describe or predict a particular trait. Okay. In terms of the perspectives that are shared across all different types of or different trait theorists, there are a few kind of shared assumptions. Okay, so the first being that people in general have a broad predisposition to respond to situations, to respond to their stimuli around them in particular ways. And so, for example, a person or people who are frequently outgoing would be considered to be generally higher on measures or the trait of extroversion. Okay. The second assumption is that we assume that overt behaviors and underlying traits are more directly linked than some of maybe the other theories do. So unlike theories that we've covered in previous lectures or earlier on in the course, like psychoanalytics, if someone reports kind of being more calm or being more at ease in terms of their behavior, then they might be more likely to possess the psychological characteristic of calmness. Okay, so there's, again, more of the assumption of the relationship between what the overt behavior is and then what the underlying trait that person is. Okay. And then the third assumption is that human behavior and personality can generally be organized into a hierarchy as well. Okay, so we'll discover this more when we go into the slides on Eysenck, I think that's how you pronounce it. But really what they had suggested was that there's specific responses are kind of like at this lowest hierarchical level. And then some of these lower responses are linked together or correlate to each other to constitute more general habits or patterns of behaviors. And then sometimes that can even more so correlate to each other into these like higher order super factors, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay. So we'll move into the discussions of the trait theory of Gordon W. Allport. And so what's important to know about this researcher or this theorist is that really what they emphasized was the healthy and more organized aspects of human behavior. And so you'll see that this is kind of in contrast to maybe some of the more psychodynamic theories or psychodynamic perspectives, where oftentimes it was this emphasis on conflicts or psychological distress. And so this is kind of a different type of focus. And actually, Allport did criticize psychoanalysts for focusing more on like these deficiencies in human behavior. So talking about things like being animalistic or being neurotic. Okay, so in terms of the personality structure in Allport's theory, so he did distinguish the difference between traits. So traits being kind of these more, consistent behaviors and activities to psychological states or behavioral activities, which were seen as kind of more of this temporary phase. And there's kind of three types of three descriptors of personality that Alport discussed. So the first being cardinal traits. So within cardinal traits, what this means is that an individual's particular disposition is so prevalent that nearly all of their acts or all of their behaviors are influenced by this particular trait. And so this is a disposition that's so pervasive and so outstanding in their life that every act can be linked back to this one particular trait. So, for example, the textbook talks about how if someone has maybe an authoritarian personality, they might see everything virtually in black and white ways. So that's kind of an example of more of a cardinal trait. Okay, so the central traits are kind of dispositions that cover more of a limited range of situations than cardinal traits. So this could be traits like honesty, kindness, assertiveness that do generally describe how an individual is, but it might not cover how they act in all situations in their life. Okay. And then finally, we have secondary disposition. So these are the least consistent traits. So an individual might possess different traits with varying degrees of generalizability to all situations. So for example, this could be, again, things like what we talked about. So maybe things like introvertedness or extroversion. It might be dependent based on the context they're in. Okay, so these might not be as consistent as cardinal traits or central traits. So just to comment overall on kind of what some of the findings of Alport were and maybe some of the criticisms of his approach or his work, he did have more of an emphasis on kind of like the theorizing or the ways that he described what traits are, but not necessarily having as much research work to back it up or to kind of establish what the utility of his approaches were. So for example, he believed that many traits were hereditary, but didn't actually conduct any research on their genetic basis. So a lot of his work was seen kind of more of this idiographic type of research. And at the time, idiographic research was seen kind of more of an anti-science, not necessarily the case anymore, but at the time, these were some of the criticisms. Idiographic research also kind of does have more of an emphasis on the uniqueness of an individual or kind of what makes people different from each other, whereas other trait theorists did not necessarily adopt that approach. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay. There isn't as much idiographic research in trait theory today. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but historically and to this day as well, most trait theorists do tend to study individual differences amongst like larger populations of people rather than kind of doing a case-by-case individual kind of analysis. Okay. So now moving on from kind of what Alport's work was and what his idea was of what trait theory is, most trait theorists now are trying to find kind of what these universal sets of traits are. And so a lot of the work after Alport's was just identifying a set of basic universal traits that's fundamental to different theories of personality. And so kind of one of the first questions or simple questions that was discussed was, what do traits occur together? And if so, what traits or what traits co-occur? So for example, it's assumed or we can understand that being aggressive or argumentative or having those traits is not as likely or as unlikely to be related to being extremely altruistic and agreeable. And so in order to kind of further this work, one of these statistical tools or statistical analysis approaches that gained more prominence in this area was factor analysis. And so really what factor analysis is this kind of method to determine the degree to which a large number of variables, often a large number of variables, go together. So we want to see to what degree a large number of variables correlate with each other. And so this is kind of a statistical analysis approach works to identify some sort of mathematical factor that represents the relationship between different items. Okay, so just to go over the details of that, the job of a psychologist or a researcher in this area would be to, of course, conduct the statistical analysis, but then the second step is also to interpret what the cluster of correlations mean. So, for example, if an individual responds on a survey saying that they like being in a large group of people and they like attending parties where there might be a lot of noise, does that mean that they are more likely to be sociable or they have high traits of sociability? So this kind of interpretation piece is what comes next. So the kind of foundation of a factor analysis approach is objective from the ground up. But again, it's the subjective decision that follows afterwards about, how many factors correlate to each other and kind of why they co-vary. And that interpretation piece is what comes next. Okay. Please let me know if you have any questions. I know Hanny's handling the chat, but feel free to unmute if you have any. Okay, so moving on to the work of Raymond B. Cattell. Cattell, I think is how you pronounce it. Really what his contribution was to understand a little bit more about factor analysis. And so in his time, this was kind of a relatively new thing. And he did see this usefulness of having some sort of taxonomy of what these basic psychological elements are. Okay, so some of his work that he contributed to this field was seeing traits and psychological traits as having some sort of hierarchical relationship or hierarchical kind of structure. And so he talked a little bit about the difference between surface traits and source traits. And so surface traits we can understand as behavioral tendencies that are literally superficial. So you can kind of guess what this means. And so this exists on the surface and is usually what is kind of observed about an individual's behavior. On the other hand, source traits are the core personality structures within Cattell's theory. And so what we can think about this as is the factors that are acquired from factor analysis. Okay, so in terms of his, way of conceptualizing personality traits, he did identify 16 different source traits that were grouped into 3 different categories. So the first category was abilities. So these are the skills and the abilities that allow us to function effectively in society. So a trait that this might be an example of an ability is, for example, intelligence. The second type of group was temperament. So this is what your kind of, the quality of your behavior is, what your emotional life is like. And so this can include things like, are you calm versus are you emotional? And then the last kind of trait category is dynamic. So these are kind of the more striving motivational lives of what an individual is. So this could be something like, for example, your conscientiousness. All right, so you might recognize kind of this type of way of looking at data from what we covered in the first tutorial. And really, this is what this has to do with is the fact that Cattell relied on 3 different types or 3 different sources of data when making his conclusions about personality and personality traits. Okay, so the first being, and again, this should be familiar to you. So the first being life records data or L data. And so this refers to kind of what everyday behavior is. So for example, what is an individual's interactions with their peers? The objective test data or OT data is kind of more referring to like miniature situations or behavioral situations wherein the subject might not be completely aware of the relationship between what their behavior is or their responsiveness or responses and then the personality characteristic that is being measured. So for example, the textbook talked about there was an experiment where they measured a person's assertiveness or tendency to be assertive based on how long they took to do a particular finger maze test. So again, in this case, the subject might not necessarily know that their behavior and how they respond is being used to look at a certain aspect or certain trait of their personality. And then the last type is, again, more common, I would say now, is self-report questionnaire data or Q data. And so this could be similar to some of the personality inventories that we see now to look at, based on those responses or how they describe themselves, what are the personality traits that they have. Okay. So originally, Cattell started with the factor analysis of L data, and he found 15 factors that did appear to account for most of an individual's personality. However, he did have some concerns that this might not be valid, or reliable for all different types of individuals. So, for example, he referred to individuals that are mental patients. He did a little bit more work to see if comparable factors could be found in Q data. And so he did some more focused research later on. And what this led to was 21 data source traits. Unfortunately, he did do many years of research, but he wasn't able to find much convergence in his data. So there wasn't this kind of one-to-one mapping of a factor found using OT data and a factor found using L or Q data. And so the research that he did in this area is a little bit muddy. Despite that, there's kind of 5 pieces of evidence that he did find for the existence of traits. And so I've listed the 5. We've listed the 5 here. So generally, there were factor analyses conducted across different sets of data. And what those found was that there were some cross-cultural similarities with regards to particular traits. There were also different kind of similarities according to age or age cohorts. And then there's kind of this utility of predicting what one's behavior is in the natural environment based on their traits. And then, as we'll talk about later, there's this evidence of more genetic contributions as well, or these kind of explanatory mechanisms for many traits. Okay. So Cattell also did not view people as kind of these static entities who behave the same way across all situations. So he did kind of acknowledge the fact that people do behave differently in different situations. And so he differentiated between kind of, he highlighted 2 other determinants, so states and roles. So states might refer to kind of what emotion and mood an individual has at a particular point in time, whereas a role could be kind of social factors that might influence how someone responds, okay? Yeah, so then there's just an example here on the slide. So for example, someone might be more likely to be more extroverted, more talkative, or yell at a soccer game rather than if they're in class. Okay, so it's dependent on kind of what their state is at that point in time, but then also kind of what's their social expectations or what their social roles are at that time as well. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of just more to say on Cattell's work. So he did kind of have more of this complex rather than necessarily just an objective method of considering the degree of a relationship between behaviors and traits. And to this day, his 16 kind of factor questionnaire does continue to be used in applied settings. However, one thing to say is that his work did have limited impact on current personality research, more so just because other theorists and theories did try to find more simpler methods or ways to measure personality. So there was this kind of move to go from the 16 factor kind of understanding to a fewer number of factors. Okay. Yeah, just for the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail here, but it's there on the slides that will be on eClass. Okay. So moving on to the work of Hans J. Eysenck. So his work looked at this three-factor theory of personality, or the trait theory. Again, he was more of a critic of psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis in general. And his work really did emphasize this biological foundation of personality traits. What he did say was that without having some sort of explanatory factor, there can be this kind of like circular explanation of explaining why people are the way they are or traits appear the way they do. So, for example, saying my TA is boring because he has a very strong case of boringness wouldn't really make sense because you're kind of explaining the trait with the same behavior. Okay. So, one of the most important pieces of work that Eysenck did do was this kind of like secondary factor analysis step. So we've talked already about the purpose of factor analysis in general, but he took this one step further to now take this initial set of factors that are correlated with each other, and kind of see whether there could be intercorrelations between these factors as well at a higher level. Okay, so while Cattell initially had these 16 factors that he came up with, many of these factors were actually strongly correlated with each other. So for example, it makes sense that someone who's reserved will also rate highly on measures or questions related to being shy. So Eysenck saw the secondary analysis factors as the highest on the trait hierarchy, and he called them these super factors. So the first two super factors that he identified were introversion and extroversion, being encompassed of one super factor, and then neuroticism. So whether someone is emotionally stable versus unstable. And then he added the third super factor of psychoticism a little bit later on. So this could refer to maybe having a lack of empathy, being more aggressive, being more antisocial. And so that's a nice acronym as well to just remember what these three different super factors are. So based on this work, he developed the Eysenck self-report Eysenck personality questionnaire. And in addition to that, like Cattell, he also developed more of these objective tests as well. So the lemon drop test, I thought it was quite interesting. So what they did was they put a standard amount of lemon juice on a subject's tongue. And what they found was that introverts and extroverts differed in the amount of saliva that was produced once that test was done. And so naturally, you would be asking yourself, why would this occur? And so I think what he was trying to kind of assert with doing this type of objective test is that there must be some sort of biological or neurophysiological function or role that the body plays in what traits we have and how they're expressed. And so, for example, in this experiment, what they thought was that individual differences in introversion and extroversion was actually related to, the introverts being more likely to be physiologically kind of aroused or stressed by a particular situation, which is why they produced more saliva. And so there is some research to support this. I would take a look at the textbook. I think it's pretty interesting, a pretty interesting experiment. Okay. So other factors that were consistent with Eysenck's biological kind of theorizing and biological, I guess, assertions that he made was that introversion, extroversion is kind of present, and these traits are stable and consistent cross-culturally. There's also more stability in individual differences over time. And then there's also research to show that there's various indicators of biological functioning that do correlate specifically with extroversion scores. So things like brain activity, heart rate, sweat gland activity are correlated with scores in aspects or scores in personality traits. Regarding neuroticism and specifically, he did theorize that biological systems like the limbic system, the autonomic nervous system, they do have a relationship with scores or measures of neuroticism. I do want to point out, though, that, again, read into the textbook as well for more details on this. But at this point, there aren't really as consistent findings, so it's important to take this with a grain of salt. Okay, so there's less known about psychoticism, so kind of that third factor that Eisnick discussed. There is some research to show that there is this genetic association of like maleness, so to speak, or aggressiveness, and higher levels of testosterone. But more recently, it's suggested to be linked with dopamine, the neurotransmitter. There's also more recent research to suggest that individuals with high levels of psychoticism have higher levels of dopamine-based neural activity. So again, there's a bit of a biological basis for this factor as well. Largely, extroversion is the most highly studied of all traits, and this makes sense because it's maybe the more of an easier behavior to observe. And so here's kind of some examples. You can look into the textbook more, but there's some research to show that introverts are maybe more sensitive to pain. They might be become fatigued more easily. And then excitement or like higher arousal levels, it does interfere more with introverts' performance compared to extroverts. And again, with all this being said, it's really important to not forget the influence of context, right? And being careful that correlation or to kind of a behavior being correlated with a biological function does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. Okay. So Eisnick also created a theory of abnormal psychology and behavioral change. And so specifically, he related psychopathological difficulties with specific personality traits and nervous system functioning. So for example, with regards to neuroticism, what he found was that there was kind of this combined effect of a biological predisposition and then being more likely to strongly react to fear-producing stimuli in the environment. And so consistent with this belief and this work, the majority of neurotic patients also have higher scores on neuroticism and lower scores on extroversion. However, despite this, Eisnick did believe that even though there's kind of this genetic predisposition to having particular traits, treatment can still be effective. These behaviors can still be unlearned. So that was kind of a big caveat to his work as well that he did acknowledge. To this day now, many have moved away from Eisnick views for 4 major reasons. So as we'll talk about later and as we've been talking about in the course, there's other 2 to 3 factor models that have been proposed that fit a little bit better with the data. And Eisnick's theories of biological bases of personality traits, particularly neuroticism and I don't know why the P is escaping my mind right now, but the P, it does lack consistent support. And so, yeah, those are some of the factors that have caused people to move away. The other 2 being, he was more likely to publish or did have a journal that was like specific to his area of personality research. So there maybe just wasn't as viewership of what his work was. And then it may be that there's more than 2 to 3 factors, right? So what about things like honesty, reliability, and creativity? So kind of wanting to expand his understanding a little bit more. Okay.
I'm happy to take over. You've talked for so long. I feel
That would be great. I would love that.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so there are 2 more chapters. I guess given that all of you guys were there earlier for the final chapter, I will not be covering it, unfortunately, due to time. It's all going to be posted under like the midterm section, so you can review it at your leisure. Like we are just basically going through these slides so you can see exactly what there is. And obviously, like the recording of the lecture from earlier will be up. Yeah, so the 5-factor model, sort of one of the more popular variations and like evolutions of trait theory, is the focus of chapter 8. Next. So many researchers believe that individual differences can be organized into these 5, sort of bipolar in the sense of having like a kind of a spectrum of which like you can be low or high dimensions known as the Big 5. And again, it's a trait approach. It's like an evolution of the other theories that we mentioned earlier. And it's also a factor analytic trait approach, similar to the more historic ones we discussed earlier. And unlike those ones, there is quite a good deal of empirical evidence that supports the Big 5 and kind of continues this model being used in personality research all the time to this day. Next. So yeah, this idea that the 5 personality factors are the foundation of individual differences in personality. So they're based on these sort of 3 things. So they are based in this like lexical hypothesis, which I would recommend you read up on in the textbook. So these traits match up to things in the natural language that people use. There is cross-cultural research that tests the universality of trait dimensions, and that's something we'll talk about later. And the relationship of trait questionnaires and then to other questionnaires and ratings, so that we have this sort of validity and reliability in between these measures to see kind of how things line up. Next. So unlike other models, it does rely on natural language. So like I said, the lexical hypothesis, I recommend reading up on that, rather than scientific operationalization of terms. So specifically in individual words, like literally pulling adjectives that describe people and people's personalities, so things like shyness, bravery, etc., from the dictionary. Individuals will rate themselves like kind of, yes, I am shy, no, I am not shy. And then you factor analyze, like Nisha discussed earlier, to see how many factors kind of these things factor to and how many factors are needed. So early work suggested 5, and then 5 has been replicated in other cases and does seem to remain similar throughout adulthood. So what are these 5 factors? So yeah, they anagram nicely depending on your preference, either ocean or canoe. So it stands for openness to other people, other experiences, to the world, conscientiousness, so being task and goal oriented, extroversion in an interpersonal setting, like how open you are to other in social interactions, agreeableness, again, interpersonal sort of thing, how like well you get along with other people, and neuroticism is sort of the one that's like a high one is associated with negative things, so like negative emotions. So yeah, here it is, the lexical hypothesis. The most important individual differences in human transactions will come to be encoded as single terms in some or all of the world's languages. That's the idea. And culturally specific dimensions would suggest that individual differences that are uniquely important to that culture. So both of these things sort of matter. Yeah, next. So are they actually universal though, right? Like that's the idea. So when considering universality, we have to consider, literally translation. Like, is there actually a one-to-one translation? Like that is a very debatable question, and it's often the answer is no. So for example, outgoing / DE, extroversion, has been mistranslated from Japanese into English as affectionate, which is an agreeableness trait. So that might lead researchers to question whether they have found the same factors in 2 different languages, but actually it's like different cultural constructs. So Big 5 research that suggests that generally this isn't an issue. There have been translations of the English questionnaires, which may cause an inadvertent bias, of course, like you're literally just transferring kind of Anglo-American cultural norms into other cultures, which is problematic. So you could instead choose words from the indigenous to like the culture, not necessarily indigenous languages, to make it more, appropriate for that culture. Some studies have suggested that it factors down to 3, not Big 5. I would recommend reading about that in the textbooks. Particularly like in the humility, honesty sort of factor, which does show up in like a Chinese context. Read up on that in the textbook. I would really recommend that. Next. So there are a number of different questionnaires that kind of work with the Big Five model. The Neo-PIR, which was alluded to earlier, and its hierarchical structure. I would recommend, again, looking at that. Like, it's an evolution of like what the Penn one was earlier. Recommend reading up on that in the textbook. So it's basically neuroticism, extroversion, openness. And then this one adds agreeableness and conscientiousness. So it integrates Eysenck's and Cattell's factors within the Big Five. And there is a correlation between these measures and the Neo-PIR. Next. So its strength is that there are both self-report and measures online for other people to complete. So studies suggest that agreement between self and observer report data align, which is good. So three major findings in the support of this. So same find factors found in the self and observer ratings. Observers agree reasonably well with each other, and O data is sometimes a better performance predictor than S data. And I think that was mentioned in the chat. So that's kind of your answer for that question. But they do kind of fall in the same category. As you can tell, it's like a questionnaire format. Next. So the one downside of the kind of, not downside, but like one sort of aspect of the five-factor theory is that they are kind of descriptive rather than being predictive necessarily. McCrae and Costa suggest that they might have a biological basis. That they causally influence individual psychological development, and the differences in Big Five related behaviors is determined by genetics, influences on neurostructure, chemicals, hormones, etc. So there is a sort of strong nature argument here and limited social experiential influence. Next. So some limitations on the other hand. So how do we link these personality structures to like processes? It's unclear how these processes work, suggesting that all individuals possess psychological structures related to each other. But yeah, there's very interesting debates to read up on in the textbook. Next. So in terms of the way that these traits and the factors sort of develop throughout the lifespan, there is correlation between measures that remain significant throughout adulthood. This does not mean there's no significant change in personality for people in general. For instance, like conscientiousness tends to go up as one enters adulthood. Extroversion and agreeableness all tend to go up as one enters adulthood. And neuroticism tends to go down as one ages. Would recommend reading up on that in the textbook. It's very interesting. But it does mean that psychologists can feel confident in the stability of the factors they are choosing for a substantial number of people or time. So even if like things change somewhat over time, the kind of proportion of it relatively to a person will kind of remain sort of similar throughout their lifespan. And yeah, like I said, there are some differences found between age and the influence of social factors. So like for conscientiousness, as you age and have more responsibilities, typically, like you have to pay your mortgage or whatever, like take care of other people, conscientiousness scores will typically go up. Next. So differing points of view exist for the stability of the Big Five throughout aging. Personality is highly biological and continuous. And while there's evidence of trait consistency, it's not high enough to warrant that change does not occur, like I mentioned. So while traits stay relatively the same, there is change in individual traits. So in general, research suggests that personality is more stable over short periods. Personality is more stable in adulthood than childhood. And while traits are stable, there are individual differences during development. And I would really recommend kind of going over this for the exam. Next. And like I mentioned earlier, like there has been some discussion about a six-factor model potentially, especially in the early 2000s. So the hypothesis was that there was a difference between I don't know what this means. Anyway, the point is like honesty and humility could be a very important factor that has been kind of overlooked due to like cultural biases. And due to the fact that the people that did the lexical hypothesis stuff focused on adjectives, but focusing on nouns and verbs might be useful as well. So most research, like we don't necessarily use that yet, but definitely a very interesting question. Next. Variability in personality may, oh yeah, so like the way that these, the way that this model can be applied to applications, the variability in personality may help predict what jobs people will choose and how they will function. The relationship between high subjective well-being and high positive emotion versus low negative emotion, so sort of mental health care. Conscientiousness wise, more highly conscientious people may live longer, be less likely to drink or smoke, more likely to exercise and eat healthier. And these come from longitudinal findings, kind of following individuals across a lifespan. Theorists also see use in clinical settings, psychological treatment choices. So people that are low in openness might need to lie on the couch talking about their mother versus like going to the gym, for example. Like that could be like a use of this model in a therapeutic context. So there is a controversy between psychologists who emphasize the importance of the personal/internal variables in determining behavior, and those who emphasize the importance of situational or external influences. So one should consider consistency via longitudinal consistency, cross-situational consistency. We should be looking at an individual's behavior in a variety of settings. So one study considering conscientiousness found that students were consistency conscientious in one setting, so great note takers in class, but not necessarily in every situation. So they might have a messy bedroom while being really organized students. But in general, trait consistency evidence is out there, but it is within domains of situations instead of across. So like home versus school, work versus friend situations. Okay. Do we want to get into this or should we call it and see if people have questions? We're so short on time that I don't want to not do it justice.
What do people think? I know there's only a few people left.
Yeah.
We can breeze through it if you would like, but otherwise we can just open it up to questions.
Breeze through? Okay. Two different options. We can kind of highlight like some sections that are like kind of important as a treat for the people that are here.
Sure.
Okay. We can skip Phineas Gage. I feel like this is something we all know about, hopefully. And probably temperament as well. Maybe let's go next. What are the questions? So yeah, basically like this is about biological mechanisms and why, like what causes kind of differences between people and how biological mechanisms and evolution are kind of, they contribute to the organism and to the way that we are. Next. So we've evolved these psychological mechanisms that have adaptive value for reproductive success. So features of the mind like problem solving that lead to reproduction, evolved mechanisms that are adaptive to a way of life in the past, but maybe not necessarily in the current world. Domain-specific mechanisms, so things that solve specific problems like finding shelter, and different domains that refer to the architecture of the mind. So there's not one information processor, there's domains for different specific problems. So the big kind of question here is like, are there sex differences in all these different adaptations? So evolutionarily, men and women had different roles. People are physically different. They had different patterns of thinking, feelings, and actions. So it's hard to draw conclusions, obviously. And the social kind of norms that we live in really create the biases that like contribute to these differences. So what is innate and what is constructed is hard to tease apart. The kind of main point of evolution is reproduction. So mate preference is sort of key to this. So selection pressures have created sex differences in mate preference. Parental investment theory, that was what Dr. Phillips was discussing just as we joined. So different costs in parenting. And the idea is that women invest more in parenting because they have fewer potential offspring than men potentially have. And pregnancy is far more burdensome on women than it is on men. So females have stronger mate preferences. If evolved psychological mechanisms are the cause of sex differences, it should be spread across cultures. So yeah, this references a study in the textbook. So this typically followed prediction. However, differences were smaller in societies where men and women have more similar roles. So there's kind of this social difference that is hard to tease apart from biological sort of things. So behavioral genetics studies genetic contributions to behavior. Selective breeding is like studying this with animals with desired traits are bred together. So like if you want pigeons with really large breasts, you find the two male and females that have the larger breasts, mate them together, and they make what you want. Yeah, mice is another example of that. Next. So obviously we can't selectively breed people. It would be very unethical. So a naturally occurring way to kind of study these things is with twins. Twins are genetically identical, and twins that have been raised separately due to like various adoption issues. The only difference in them hypothetically is due to their environments. So yes, the textbook goes into like good examples of variations between people and how basically there aren't that many with twin studies, which is very interesting. So this I would really recommend looking at the H2. So this refers to the heritability coefficient, which is the degree to which genetic variations determine variations among people in a personality characteristic. So the amount of variation that is not explained due to genetic factors, the remaining part must be environmental. So a higher one, it would be like weight is a relatively higher one, 0.6. Most personality traits are a little lower at 0.3. IQ is 0.5. So that means that in the population, 50% of like variation between individuals in a population is due to genetics, and the rest is due to environmental causes. And again, I would recommend looking at that. Next. So yes, genes and the environment are very linked. They influence each other, and enriched environments improve, for instance, improve maze learning in dull rats. That's an example of when genes kind of interact with the environment and kind of make the rats kind of be different than their genetic sort of predisposition. So shared environments are things, so like influences that make siblings more alike. So that's a really dark example, the same car accident. Okay. But yeah, basically like being raised in the same family may cause some similarities between siblings, for example, but other things also really matter and sometimes matter more for siblings. So for example, birth order, like Dr. Phillips described, peers, mentors, etc. Yeah, very interesting and good to know for this assessment. Next. So some environmental influences may have different effects. So for instance, an anxious parent may have more of an effect on children that always watches a parent. So different genetic constitutions may evoke different responses. For instance, a cranky child can make a parent angry, and individuals with different constitutions select different environments. So for example, some people who just want to like move away. Next. I think we can skip neurotransmitters. It is a classic in any psychology textbook, so always refresh that. But I feel like we don't need to discuss that right now. Can just skip that, but take a look at it in the textbook. And plasticity, so it kind of, actually that has to do with the previous one, so never mind. So let's move on. Yes, and fMRIs are functional a way to see the kind of ways that the brain changes during specific tasks. So even for things like judgments about the self, and the prefrontal cortex, for example, is involved in self-referential judgments. Next. Okay, wow. Any questions? Thanks so much for flipping the slides.
Okay, so yes, the slides and the recording will be posted online. And I think that should be all for today. Okay, see everyone next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.